Hello, my name is David Ades. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of a monthly poetry reading series and podcast series now called Poets Corner, in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's West. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new world will see a sharing and a closeness of spirit. As many of you will know now, each month I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them for an hour or so around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Toby Fitch, who will read poems and talk on the theme of duration. But first, an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. I would like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging of the Wallamita people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. Toby Fitch is poetry editor of Overland, a lecturer in creative writing at the University of Sydney, and the director of AVANT GAGA and the Poetry Night at Sappho Books. He's the author of 7 books of poetry, including Where Only the Sky Had Hung Before, and most recently, Sydney Spleen, Giramondo 2021. For more information, go to tobyfitch.net. That is a very modest bio note for a poet who has many more achievements than that note might suggest. Hi, Toby, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hi, David. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm tuning in from Wiradjuri country, down on the border of New South Wales and Victoria. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and any tuning in. And I would also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people on whose lands I wrote all the poems in this book.
Right.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm very pleased that lockdown is finally over here. The topic duration is very topical for me after that tortuous period. I was going to say the timing of this podcast on this theme, after we've just come out of that lockdown, seems particularly apt. When you sent me the theme, you gave me a long list of things that we might talk about on the subject through your poems. The theme clearly has multiple facets for you. What are the most compelling aspects of the theme for you?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably, I mean, it allows us to just talk about writing during the pandemic and to think through how it's changed the conditions of writing for us. And obviously duration. There's a lot more thinking about our mortality. And that's come into my poems a fair bit, I would say, in this collection, more so than in previous collections. I think I've also written a lot more longer poems, and writing longer poems, writing books, there is a certain kind of duration to that. We've had to deal with a lot of patience, endurance, persistence, playing the long game. I've personally had to I've had some employment battles over the last little while during the pandemic as well. So that's required a lot of persistence and endurance. I've also run the Poetry Night at Sappho Books for over 10 years now. So that's a kind of endurance I've been thinking about recently. Keeping up with things, keeping up with work, keeping up with writing, keeping up with the poetry world. So there's plenty to think through, I guess.
And a young family on top of that.
And a young family, yes. Yes, having 2 daughters and with my partner and our dog as well, who's right at the end of her life. So that's yeah. Point there.
As a lecturer, editor, live poetry presenter, author, poetry prize judge, your life is invested and immersed in poetry in so many ways. I have no idea how you find the time and energy to do it all. In terms of duration, do you have long-term strategies and plans for your poetry, or is it something that just evolves more organically with time?
I've definitely found new techniques to continue writing. I've always found, like, since I reached just before I became a teenager, I became quite interested in creating things, making things, and it was music through my teens. And it got me through the usual kinds of, I don't know if the usual kinds, but the kinds of depression that maybe most teenagers experience, like creating songs and then writing lyrics for them became a really meaningful thing. And I think I've not been able to ever let that go, or at least it gives me meaning. And when I found poetry in my early 20s and really started to take it seriously, I just don't think I could do without poetry. But in terms of like long-term strategies, I guess like in my 20s, I was a little bit beholden to the myth that, inspiration strikes and that poems just come sometimes. And, there is a certain feeling that happens with certain poems like that. But really, it's because you've done a lot of work and a lot of thinking and a lot of reading, and it coalesces or it coheres in certain moments. And so finding ways to harness that and to create a practice around that has been something that I like to think I've developed over the years. And so I've worked through a lot of different kind of generative techniques to create ideas for poems, and I've learned new forms, and I'm always experimenting with new forms. That's one way to kind of start something new and find something new, is try something you've never tried before. And I always keep trying to try to keep doing that. But having kids was also, discombobulated time and discombobulated my practice in some way. So finding the time is more like, when there is free time, I try to take advantage of it in ways that I didn't used to. And I also just write late at night and well into the night, and deal with the tiredness in the morning.
As best you can, yes. The poems you're going to read today are all from Sydney Spleen, your latest book. I want to read from the back cover of the book because I think it gives a concise and very accurate sense of what to expect from reading it. Sydney Spleen takes Baudelaire's concept of spleen as melancholy with no apparent cause, characterised by a disgust with everything, and combines it with a contemporary irony so as to articulate the causes of our doom and gloom: corporate rapacity, climate change, disaster capitalism, the plague, neo-colonialism, fake news, fascism, and how to raise kids in a world fast becoming obsolete. The backdrop of this collection is sparkling Sydney and its screens, through which the poet mainlines global angst. Fitch's Spleen poems, with their radical use of form and tone, are as much as an aesthetic experience as a literary one. Translation becomes homage, satire, song, essays become lyrics, rants, dreams. What is a poem when no one believes in the future now anyway? Nor is the collection lacking in humour. Sydney Spleen mocks everything in its crystal glass, yet still finds real moments of connection to cherish. I think that pretty much nails it. I want to ask you first whether you had a concept for this book and then wrote the poems to fit the concept, or whether you wrote the poems first and then found the narrative arc of the book when you put them together.
I have to say a bit of both. The concept sort of grew over time. When I guess there are some poems in here that date back at least 5 years, maybe more, 2015, 2016. And at that time and thereafter, I was like, some of my books were projects in their own sense. They were already a concept. And so I was starting to write more politically engaged poems. And I was also starting to write some more poems with autobiographical elements in them, and they weren't suiting those book projects. So I started putting them aside in a folder on my computer. And I mean, you'd know, and some listeners might know that I've had a preoccupation with sort of French poetics and early modern French poetics and that kind of thing. And a previous book of mine, The Bloom and Notions of Arthur Rimbaud, takes all of Arthur Rimbaud's prose poems from Illuminations, his book Illuminations, and turn them backwards. So I've always been interested in that kind of like, that kind of source material, reworking it and using it as a generative sort of thing to create new poems that are completely different from those poems, or largely different. Sometimes they're quite close translations, but not otherwise. But anyway, that book of Rimbaud's has been really formative for a decade or two for me. I've always loved it, but I've also really loved Charles Baudelaire's Paris Spleen. I guess, which, like mine, is like Sydney Spleen is situated in a major capital city at a time of high, or a time of late capitalism. Somewhat similar to what we're going through now. Obviously vastly different, but it has some parallels. And I started to see some of these new poems I was writing with a more sort of angry, political, autobiographical bent as perhaps some kind of project around Spleen, and maybe I could do something around Sydney, because earlier books of mine, like my first book, Rorschach, there were some autobiographical elements, and there was some more attention to the specific sort of location that I live in and that, but I did leave a lot of that behind at that stage, and just played with poems and what they can do. But anyway, so this is a kind of return in some ways to the real. I mean, that's been increasing in my books, but this one is very overtly a return to the real, or at least reality, my reality, and my, the people around me and the places around me. So, but yeah, it was a project that was languishing actually for some time as other sort of books took sway. And so but then the pandemic happened, and I had ideas for poems, and then more ideas for poems, and I was just like, processing things on the spot basically with this book. Like it really felt like that. It felt a lot more urgent than a lot of other poetry I've written. So I just went for it, and most of the poems were actually written in 2020.
Yes, I mean, I gathered that, and I was kind of thinking, how on earth did you do that and get it out so soon? But was the idea of duration in your mind when you were putting together the book, or is it something that has emerged once the book's put together and you sort of reread it and you thought, oh, this is what's going on here?
I think it's emerged. I'm not very good at picking themes in general. Like, I think they emerge when I'm writing, and so being put on the spot was good, because it made me look back at the themes of the book a bit more closely, and I just realized that there just is a central theme of duration and time, and the way time has been changed because of the way we now have to do so much on Zoom, and just to connect with people and just to keep up with work that we have to keeping up with, and so I think the poems are dealing with that in various ways, or at least just depicting it.
Okay, well, I suppose we better read some.
Okay. Well, we've decided on a small handful and then a very long one at the end. And I thought we could start with this one, which sets a scene and kind of is about poetry. And it's called An Absolutely Ordinary Rainbow, an Absolutely Ordinary Poem. Let's not confuse it with the Les Murray poem, which it definitely alludes to, and others. I guess we could talk about that in a sec. But should I read it first?
Please.
Yeah. An Absolutely Ordinary Poem. Martin Place was dark, all the cafes were empty, an office above flickered with fluoro light, and the poem on the pavement was petrified to find itself alone. It wanted someone to pick it up, unscrumple and read it out, consider its noble intention, maybe even to entice a knowing smile, a tear. The poem thought it was a good poem, an important poem, made of ink and paper, sure, but a complex thing, like a heart or a church, like a computer chip or a bet, a formula for tomorrow's stocks. It had the economy of graffiti and yet untold weight, as if it had carried a burden across years and lands, having witnessed flood, famine, fire, pestilence, war. But if no one read it, how could it be sure? Perhaps people were engrossed in other more pressing matters, disasters of their own unmaking. Perhaps it was just a shit poem. The poem sat on the mapped grey pavers. Night deepened, echoes came, and soon after, an angular wind that pushed the poem from gutter to fountain, lamp post to bank step, round bollards and over a chalked eternity. How many circles would it complete before a many-fingered rain flattened the poem out, poured over its words till they were all torn up into moonshine that no one could read, even if they'd been there to read it?
Yeah, so there's always a risk writing poems about poems. And we've all done it, I'm sure. You navigate that risk here by having the poem examine its own relevance with the kind of internal scrutiny that often goes on in our own heads about ourselves. And so I read it as a metaphor for the human condition. You know, who will notice us? Who will think we have any significance? Who will understand our depth and complexity? How do we endure our loneliness and often invisibility? Was all this in your mind when you wrote the poem, or am I attributing too much to it?
No, I like those attributions. I'll take those. I think it's easy to, with a poem, to get caught up in perhaps its influences or, you know, what it really might be specifically trying to say. But at the back of my mind was definitely those things. Because it's, you know, it's not just the, you know, the perceived lack of importance of poetry in the contemporary world, perhaps, despite maybe, you know, some, you know, despite maybe a return to poetry, that there are more people like trying out poetry, particularly in younger generations. But, you know, there is that anxiety that poetry has nothing to say and is of no importance. And so it's playing with that. But, you know, like you say, it's I like to think it's a bit broader than that. You know, that's what we're trying to do with poems. We're trying to speak in multiple ways. But, you know, it's also a silly poem and a kind of bit of a joke poem. Like it's derived actually from a poem called A Certain Swirl by Mary Ruefle, American poet who's really excellent. So hers is a shorter prose poem about a sentence that is never read, or that follows a similar storyline to the poem here, but mine is quite different and goes in another direction and I guess sort of obviously alludes to the pandemic with no one around. And but I'm also poking fun at some important poems in Australian poetry, Les Murray's An Absolutely Ordinary Rainbow, and then John Forbes's On the Beach, a Bicentennial Poem, which was, you know, around about 1988, which also, so Forbes's poem also sort of pokes fun at Les Murray's poem in some ways. Like, so in Les Murray's An Absolutely Ordinary Rainbow, we get that Man from Snowy River kind of rhythm to it. It's got that balladry kind of thing going on, or maybe, and there's a man in Martin Place just relentlessly weeping. And it brings Martin Place to a standstill. But by the end of the poem, he simply walks off through the crowd, like after having this epiphany. Like it's a kind of epiphany that he's having in Les Murray's poem. John Forbes's poem takes that scene. John Forbes's poem is about lots of things, obviously trying to be about Australia in various ways, and maybe the Australian condition, or what it means to be an Australian, and what the country is in some ways. So it's a big poem in Forbes's eyes, I think. But in the second part of it, it's in fragments. In the second part of it, some trade unionists are in Martin Place, and they're all watching a man behead a chicken, and they're not being religious in the poem. They bet on how many circles the headless chook will complete. So the poem in my one is also doing circles and is you know, has lost its head in some ways too. Or maybe the poet has, or maybe we all have, I don't know. But like, you know, there's various sort of silly layered jokes in there as well. But I wanted to not make them too foregrounded in the poem at all. Like the poem wanted the poem to be itself.
The book has some wonderful endnotes that talks about, you know, specific poems' connection to other poems and other poets, and I found them very interesting to read. And I was going to actually ask you about how your poem converses with the poems that you referred to in the endnote, but you've already answered that question. So I'll just ask one more thing. The poem has no volition of its own. It's subject to, you know, an angular wind and then a many-fingered rain, and ends up becoming something that no one could read. And there is a sense to me here and in other poems in the book of fragility and impermanence, which is in a way the flip side to endurance or duration. So I was wanting to ask you what your thoughts are on the relationship between duration and impermanence.
Oh, that's a big, tricky question.
Without notice.
Well, perhaps maybe the drive to keep on living is like tying those two things together. You know, and maybe in this poem, despite being at the whims or at the whims of larger forces, the way we all are, and the way that has been brought to our immediate attention with the pandemic, perhaps despite that, the poem still wants to be a poem, and we do want to keep going. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question better than that.
Yeah. All right. Do you want to read another one?
Sure. There's a slightly longer one in the middle of the book. So that one was from part one. This is from part two, where part one introduces a lot of themes, I guess, and part two becomes much more linguistically playful and openly political. And there are poems that sort of poke fun at our politicians. But this one is, I don't know how to describe this one straight up. It's in three parts. They're all 26 lines, and all the sentences are barely sentences. They're almost like, you know, just sort of unfinished clauses, most of them without verbs. So there's something to say about that maybe. But there's a lot of collaging in this poem as well. So there's, or appropriating and rephrasing throughout the three parts, lines from Baudelaire's Paris Spleen. Not so much taken at random, but found to suit the themes of what was happening when I was writing the poem. And there are other lines or phrases that come from other poets as well. But again, not always like straight sort of quotations, but sort of sort of phrased for the poem itself. And the first of the three, there's a couple from Sean Bonney, the late poet and activist from the UK. And then the second one has a couple of lines from Ernst Bloch, and then not a poet, but more of a sort of political philosopher. And then the third one has some from Pam Brown, a noted Sydney poet. But maybe I should just read it. It's called Sparkling Anxiety. And some of the listeners might know from the internet and memes where sparkling anxiety comes from. And I might actually read that out first before I get to it. Where's it gone here in the notes? Yeah, sparkling anxiety adapts and collages phrases, blah, 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 blah. Its title cites a meme that went viral on Twitter. Quote the meme: "It's only existentialism if it comes from the existentialism region of France. Otherwise, it's just sparkling anxiety." So that's where its title comes from. 1. The moving shapes of smoke, like flowers, like dusk. The man who sets himself on fire after being denied medical treatment. Cops and bills and bricks shat. The fact that Sydney lockouts haven't curbed CBD assaults. The inability to sit still. Your English passport will soon expire, like milk, the cause of all your misfortune. Assuming the ocean is infinite, stratospheric pricing of luxury brands, furniture that appears to dream, the paradigm of the little red boat shuddering on the horizon, the language of silent fabric, like flowers, like dusk, the energy which pleasure does not absorb, Wi-Fi and piss takes and blowjobs, added luxury tax, the scent of a struck match, the mobile architecture of clouds, bubbles in space, the difference between champagne and sparkling wine, holes in the calendar, cannot be alone, ask the wind, a wave, a star, draw your life as a Venn diagram, make a shopping choice, like milk, subtle and irrefutable witticisms, alleviate your syntax, imperative sadness, the obligation to die at some point, like flowers, like dusk. Your baby teeth are probably still out there somewhere. 2, your baby teeth are probably still out there somewhere, getting chewed up and spat out by one digestive system or another. Inertia, a path one strangely recalls. Gambling, that superhuman amusement, like fists, like immense and untiable knots. Your face in city windows, genuflecting, unmasked and en masse. Demonic tantrums in the daylight, the hellish intensification, consumption as a mode of perception, the parade of images, doom scrolls, creatures who seek happiness in movement, as in phosphorescent vapor, as in a vial, as in the violence of glass when you can't contain the urge to drop it. The moon, who is caprice itself, formless streams, threads, the place where you are not, marriage and the nuclear, the lover you will never know, flowers of monstrous shape, like fists, like minced, untiable knots, like black spots in the sun, like black swans in a time before Australia, systems of memory, as in the law, as in big data, as in delirious perfume, the hand-wringing over whether to punch a Nazi or not, the lover you don't need to know, a fossilized piece of moon. 3, a fossilized piece of moon, the American spelling, like debauchery, like democracy, sexist contrails over the skyline, thunder, boredom, accidentally becoming counter-revolutionary, losing self to the concept of world, what world and whose, too mapped out of future versus daily crop up, self-punishment for self-delusion, peals of laughter, weird domestic sadness prisms, androgyny, the fear of being out of touch with the demotic for identifying this way, flirting with solipsism, footnoted artworks, the changing coloration of the sea, all the qualities that make you believe immortality, like debauchery, like democracy, toppling into the mire on the side of the road, hail the size of golf balls, flooded greens, being flat out, too tired to die, pearls of laughter, concentric circles of piss, the debate over whether the furthest planet from our knot of light is even a planet, not conforming to this neoliberal system of spheres. Scroll on, sourdough and tear gas and plague, sunny echo chambers, walking about with a face, mask on, the moving shapes of smoke.
Well, thanks for introducing that with the meme from Twitter, because when I first read the poem without the benefit of the notes, I was intrigued by the combination of the words sparkling and anxiety, which are two words I would not ordinarily put together, and then that explained that. Reading the poem reminded me of a kind of shimmering pointillist painting. Are you thinking here of anxiety as having multiple facets and a kind of heightened alertness?
Absolutely, yes. Yep. And now I remember writing this and I was trying to just take little moments of anxiety and capture them in each clause. So yeah, it has a rhizomic quality to it, I guess, or a pointillist kind of aesthetic going on. Probably because that's probably because that is sometimes the feeling when you're fragmented by your own anxieties or the anxieties that are forced upon you by various sort of systems and structures. Yeah.
And the clipped staccato half phrases, half sentences feed into that.
Well, yeah, there's this how could I put this? They're never resolving themselves. And so the anxiety is kind of perpetual in this poem. And that's I experienced that kind of state when anxiety is really sort of taking hold in some ways. There's a feeling that it won't go away, but there's this irresolvableness in some ways that I was trying to capture. And I think that was the sort of technical conceit that might have helped, but I don't know.
I don't know. You begin and end the poem with the line, "the moving shapes of smoke," which suggests that the anxiety is wispy, nebulous, that by flitting constantly from one thing to another, it can't solidify.
Yeah.
So there's all this sort of these scattershot observations that you've picked up, sometimes repeating with subtle variation. Does that mean that the anxiety can't actually fixate on anything? It's so overwhelming that it just goes from thing to thing to thing to thing and never stops.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, the moving shapes of smoke was also like the remnants of, you know, the bushfires as well. And so, like when we were first starting to wear masks, there was still summer on the air in Sydney, and all of those memories. So there was already those unresolved anxieties from that kind of apocalyptic event or events that happen across the country. And then, of course, there was the floods and the massive hailstorms and then the pandemic. So it was all, I guess I'm trying to allude to a lot of those things all at once because they're all feeding our anxieties in so many ways. There seems to be other kinds of collective anxieties as well that I'm hoping to kind of allude to in poems like this. Yeah.
I mean, there's a global anxiety. I mean, I certainly see it with my kids and what's going on with the schools, and it's hard to sort of, it's like this big wave and it just won't stop. But I want to come back to the idea of impermanence again. I'm going to gnaw at that like a little bit of a bone. There's a lot in this poem that suggests that, to me, beginning with that first line and lines like the obligation to die at some point. Like, is there a philosophical or other underpinning that we're all here on borrowed time, that we are, if you like, guests on the planet?
I think so. Yeah, and I also think there's something about we've kind of ruined that in so many ways too, like with climate change the way it is, and like the future looking very dire. Like, we need to change things, and we need to not to not die out. And you know, like I'm saying those things with a bit of a tongue in cheek or a bit of an irony in there as well. Like there's a sort of affect that we certainly experience in the way we perform online through social media in various ways, in these little fragments of text that we use to express a whole bunch of sort of unresolved anxieties. And you know, they're often done with a certain sense of humor or irony, or what many people are calling a kind of post-irony or something, which, you know, is absolutely sentimental, or maybe sentimental is the wrong word, sincere at the same time. So I feel like I'm trying to tap into some of those affects as well, because it's also the way we communicate at the moment to get us through.
Yeah. And how does this sort of kind of poem sit with the idea of duration, do you think?
It's probably it's quite cyclical, in the sense like the first line is the last line, and then the end line of each section of the poem begins the next part of the poem. So it is a cyclical thing, and I guess it's you know, maybe that's speaking to some kind of like hope that there will be that the, you know, that not only that the, well, I mean, it's I guess it's definitely depicting that these anxieties are cyclical and return and come back in slightly different forms, but perhaps also there's you know, a sense that there is a way through that. There is a way to endure through that. Just trying to see if there are any lines that speak directly to duration that I could think of. Nah. Yeah. Did you? How do you see it relating to duration or impermanence?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Those two things are flip sides of the same coin, and so quite often something can be both in a way, even though they're opposites. That we are living in a state, well, we have the illusion that things are permanent when they're not. It's a comforting illusion to have. But deep down, we all know that we're living in a state of impermanence, and that to make the best of that state of impermanence, we need to, and to have meaning to our lives, we need to fill our days with things that either create or in some other way give meaning to our lives. And that even if there is an anxiety that permeates all that, as there is, it doesn't stop us from the endeavor. I think that's my assessment of it. Let's go to the next poem.
All right. So moving into the third section of the book, which I guess zooms out a little bit from Sydney. I mean, the sparkling, I should have mentioned, the sparkling in Sparkling Aside was also, that trope has you know, cropped up in the book prior to that poem. So it's already referring to, you know, Sydney and its you know, its various emerald capacities as a beautiful city or whatever. You know, and I'm quite critical of a lot of that, but yeah, moving into the third section, it sort of branches out. Maybe there's a few more bird's eye views of things and historical views of colonialism and the like. This poem isn't particularly about that, although there is some attention to climate change and animals in this third section as well. So this poem is about, you know, an animal, and you know, also about the speaker's sort of relation to the animal and identity in some ways. And it's called Entanglement, you know, alluding to our sort of entanglement with all the living beings on the planet. So I might as well read it. It's a true story. I living in Newtown at the time, like just a few doors from the train line, and I was in my back garden, and a pet parrot with clipped wings came and got stuck in our back garden for a little bit, and I had seen the lost signs of the parrot on the telegraph poles around us. And this is a story of what happens kind of around that, because it does leave the garden, and it refers in the poem leads. The poem alludes to multiple sort of time frames before the parrot, you know, when the parrot's there as well. So I'll just read it and catch my breath for it, because it's all one sentence. Something I like to do with poems. Entanglement. I am watching myself untangle my earphones. My body's walk paused, standing on the corner of Bedford and Probert, beneath mini grotesques on the roof of a white and grey self-renovated house, its ghost gum swaying in the wind as 3 trains careen by from different origins, interlocking like snaking blocks of Tetris. The passengers on board, watching my body, standing there on the corner of Probert, its fingers untangling earphones, its eyes fixed on a missing parrot poster taped to a telegraph pole, mind fixating on whether the silk shirt they're wearing, white feathers on black, expresses their gender today, standing on the corner of Probert, sun splitting the clouds, as a gap opens up between trains, permitting past and future to collide. I am watching myself untangle my earphones from the roof. With the mini grotesques I crouch beside, ghost gum convulsing in the wind, silver leaves within reach, but obscuring the vermilion and forest green parrot, whose clipped wings have carried it from Lilyfield to Newtown, one dry urban tree to the next, and into my garden, from which I've climbed to the rooftops in pursuit of the missing bird, whose family has arrived to shout advice from the street, along with 2 firemen, some neighbours and passers-by, as 3 trains speed to separate destinations, interlocking like snaking blocks of Tetris, my body spaced out across lightweight tin roof, mind fixating on whether I'm capable of holding this creature who doesn't want to be held, sweat dripping all the way to the sidewalk, sun splitting the clouds as a gap opens up between trains, synapses tethered to the silver leaves, the wild expectations of the street, the vermilion and green blur as the parrot slips my grasp, glides out across Bedford, just clearing the fence to the train tracks, clipped wings flapping, but not rising, the thud of its body audible over the screech of metal on metal, the bright bird feathered on the dark rocks of the tracks, face up to the sky. For days to come, I am watching myself untangle.
Oh, I'm one of these kind of guys who would buy a book for a poem like that. That just blows me away. And to me, I get the sense of your poetry, and this is true of many poets, but some more so than others, your poetry being one word very deliberately placed next to the next word. There's a huge amount of craft in the poetry. And I come from this poem thinking how tangled everything has become in our world, and how impossible it is to disentangle. At the beginning and end of the poem, you're watching yourself untangle, but the process hasn't concluded at the end of the poem, and it never does it?
No, that's right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those kind words. This poem was written very late in the book and happened very quickly when I wrote it. It was one of those kinds of poems. The experience had happened a few months prior, or even actually a year and a half prior. So it was kind of pre-pandemic, but it was definitely, I mean, I loved writing the poem. I was like, it was a very pleasurable experience, sort of trying to get those lines to interlock and refer back to each other, but sound different each time they recur. And that's that entanglement that I guess I'm trying to sort of represent there.
And you allude to it with the Tetris blocks, really. I mean,
which sort of conjures up all those sort of childhood memories as well, which I'm trying to get in there, and a sense of becoming in the world, and never quite really evolving in some ways, and always being the same again, or something like that.
Well, another thing that I liked about the poem is that you're both participant and observer, watching yourself from several different vantage points, which is a kind of tangle in itself. The act of observation like this is intriguing. You are inside yourself and outside yourself at the same time. We are all voyeurs on our own lives and often critics at the same time. And all these other things are going on around us as we are doing that. By writing it down, you're recording an observation of yourself, observing yourself. But you're also situating yourself both in a moment in time and in a place, and all around you there is movement and momentum and things spinning off in different directions. And this is a commentary on how we're all living our frantic lives now, isn't it?
Perhaps. I mean, definitely, there's certainly a frantic coming to grips with the moment in this poem that that could be read as a broader comment, for sure. There's also a coming to grips with oneself in those moments, and what you did, or what you chose to do, or what you tried to do, and having to live with those choices too. And there's also the kind of harking back to the previous self. So a self from a different time before the bird arrived, seeing the bird poster on the on the telegraph poles, and you know, wondering how all those little moments led to this particular moment. And yeah, because we're all living moment to moment as well, and that's even more heightened, I think, right now.
Yeah, it's very fluid. And that sort of brings me to my next question. Is there a sense here that we are all just tiny cogs in a huge inexorable machine, and that we are unable to influence things much?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I've always had that feeling, and yeah,
you're still writing. You're still writing poetry, trying to influence things.
Well, yeah, for me, it definitely writing poems. If I wasn't writing poems, I don't know what I would do. Like there's a sense of there's a seeking out meaning. You know, like poesis is making. Its etymology is making. So you're making meaning, and you know, like it is a survival technique as well, or at least an endurance technique or strategy for living. And you know, I think if more people wrote poetry, yeah, it's not going to, like, you know, this poem isn't going to save the bird. You know,
no,
it's not going to save. You know, it's not going to stop the trains, and it's not going to what have you. It's not this climate change or anything, but it's this. You know, there's a reckoning, I guess, with that, and what happens in every moment, and how we might conduct ourselves, I guess, and what it means to be who we are. A
reckoning and a consciousness, a seeing. And I mean, the job of poetry, one of the jobs of poetry, is to alert people to see.
Yeah.
What otherwise might not be seen. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, we are now going to move on to your long poem, Morning Walks in a Time of Plague. Do you want to say anything about this poem before you start reading from it? You just want to get stuck into it?
I will say a few things, just so that everyone listening knows the people involved, I guess. So, I mean, it'll take me about 18 to 20 minutes to read it, I think. It's the last poem of the book. It's section 4 of the book, and it's entirely autobiographical and covers it's called Morning Walks in a Time of Plague, and covers all those morning walks that my partner and our kids did to pass the time, or at least occupy ourselves. Not that we didn't have other things like homeschooling to occupy ourselves with, and work and all that, because that didn't stop for us at the time. But yeah, so each of the 25 fragments, they're all numbered. Each of them is basically one new day, one new walk. And the first few are just to our local tiny park. And then we branch out and go to the local cemetery, which is Camperdown Cemetery and Camperdown Memorial Rest Park, which is a very beautiful historical sort of oasis in the middle of the inner west. And what else can I say about it? So I was obviously reading a bunch of things and taking them on my walk and looking things up on my phone. So I quote Camus and Boccaccio and other writers in there. So you'll hear that. And the people in the poem are my partner, Frankie, our kids, our eldest daughter, Evie, and our youngest, Tilda, and our black staffy, who's very old now. She's 14 now. She was 13 at the time of the poem, called Minky. So that probably covers it. And the Australian poet John Forbes provides a kind of, I guess, controlling image, or maybe not a controlling image, something like through one of his poems, which is the sort of glittering sort of mica in the pavement, which then becomes other images throughout the poem. So I'll just read it and see how we go. And I thought this might be appropriate for a podcast, just for, you know, listening and sort of enduring through that, and just the theme as well. And it's because there aren't many other places you can read a long poem like this, I think. All right. Morning walks in a time of plague. 1. The new routine for walking Minky and our daughters. Our daily state-sanctioned depression walk has evolved into feeding the unicorns at a small deserted park in the Newtown backstreets, opposite a red brick apartment block on Lennox where John Forbes once happened to live. Quote, shiny flecks of mica in the footpath tar, reflecting now. We pick purple skyflower, pink-white bower plant, and orange bougainvillea in the back alleys on the way, promise each other not to pick every flower in the neighbourhood. 2. Blue astroturf shaped like a great big crescent moon centres the play. Evie and Tilda circle on scooters. Pick a dandelion, make a wish. Takes Evie a dozen puffs to scatter the spores which cascade through a shaft of white sunlight back into the grass. 3. In the warm morning air, Frankie and I talk about the days of isolation mounting, the fear of encountering other bodies, what space is, the molecular traces we leave on surfaces, washing in the webbing of the girls' tiny hands to the tune of cloud busting, and daily trying to remember what colour is. The unease in the air over deserted streets reminds me of the cloud of radiation in Christa Wolf's Accident, A Day's News, only invisible and colourless, landing on every surface, wood, plastic, metal, glass, then picked up on fingers and palms and spread indiscriminately by each of us. I read snippets of Boccaccio's The Decameron on my phone like I'm informing myself. Quote, one citizen avoided another, hardly any neighbour troubled about others, relatives never or hardly ever visited each other. Moreover, such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women by this calamity, that brother abandoned brother, and the uncle his nephew, and the sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. What is even worse and nearly incredible is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children as if they had not been theirs. The terrace on the corner of the park with Atticus graffitied on its laneway wall blasts Billie Eilish in ballad mode. I could say, I could lie, say I like it like that, I like it like that. Wind through the pine needles, the dilapidated artist's commune over the road looms like an abandoned hospital. We call the girls in close. 4. Chirruping lorikeets glister in the sun that lights up the little park's blooming paper bark. Minor birds swoop Minky like she's a threat. A shiny black staffy, she sometimes looks like a tiny panther, but spinal decay and surgeries to both back legs means no chasing birds anymore. Dark pink early crocus for the unicorns this time. No, alicorns, Evie reminds me. Evie reminds me these are winged unicorns and that we're feeding. Tilda stacks it hard twice on her scooter. Evie helps her up the second time. Looking up from her phone, Frankie tells me the number of cases among children is super low. On the four-way seesaw, Piggy, Froggy, Chicken and Whale, the girls, helmets still on, demand I stand in the middle and do the rocking. It's Soviet-era metal screeches as I wheeze. Frankie jumps up, grabs my hips. The clanking of the seesaw conjures in me the same self-conscious feeling a rickety bed does. Out of the corner of my eye, I scan for voyeurs on the crossroad. 5. We place flowers under the seesaw for the alicorns because the wind is too strong to leave flowers anywhere else without them blowing away. Pine needles whir, fall like digital rain. Through my phone's camera, the lone grey gum leaning southward in the centre of the park looks underslept. 6. White rock trumpets in our hands for feeding the alicorns. As the wind circles, slower today, the whirring of the pines could be a distant ring road, though I know the highways are mostly empty. The odd train rattles and zooms by, a block down the road, but their infrequency is jarring. We're more accustomed to their constant static. Likewise, the low plains and the silt, like static's residue on everything. I quit smoking before Christmas when smoke from the wildfires was choking the city, but I keep returning to this passage in Forbes's Sydney, poem called Sydney. Quote, you're reconciled to breathing gunk you can't escape, don't want to, defined by decisions you took for granted years ago, like shiny flecks of mica in the footpath tar, reflecting now your own pattern of stars, free to sparkle, not fake free-willed human particle as if being shiny was to choose, to refuse. I used to like to think the footpath reflected the stars, but now all I see is ground glass. Evie and Tilda play hide and seek with their helmets on behind opposing sandstone walls. In the background, pale yellow banksia flowers, upright like candles, floating. Limping across the crescent moon, Minky's back legs seem to fail her more by the day. Yesterday, she left dribbles of shit on the upstairs carpet. 7. Playgrounds are now illegal, but we go anyway to the same deserted park we're calling the Chicken Park, everyone's favourite seesaw favourite. Sun is bleary through the pine needles as if through frosted glass, and yet it's going to be a warm one today, miners dangling in the paper barks like tea bags. Girls crash head on their scooters. I stumble over Joshua Clover on Twitter, quote, "Against the genre of recalling moments before the plague with great nostalgia and a sense that we failed to value the small pleasures of daily life, I say no. Life 2 months ago was tedious and miserable for the great majority of the globe, and it remains our fate to transform it entire." Fragments of Camus' La Peste, the plague, follow in quick succession. Quote, "Each of us had to be content to live only for the day, alone under the vast indifference of the sky." Mini pine cones drop to the ground. 8. Pink bower vine, star clusters, scarlet geraniums, and periwinkle for the alicorns. "Look how deep the grass is," Tilda says. 9. Chicken Park temporarily closed. Quote, "Inner West Council has closed the playground in line with advice from the Australian government. This is to keep the community safe at this time." The four-way seesaw has what looks like crime tape all over it. Makes me wonder whether the same cops fining joggers for stopping to eat a kebab are responsible for taping it all up, or was it council workers? I remember when Evie was a toddler and I took her to the playground next to Camperdown Cemetery one morning. We were the only ones there. As she began to soar on the swings, "I'm flying, Daddy." In the brisk glare, a council worker stormed through the playground with his leaf blower on full. He came right up to us, blasting at our feet like we weren't there. Evie was petrified, inconsolable. 10. To avoid other people staying apart together, we go to Camperdown Cemetery, a green oasis in the densely built-up streets we live on, but it's nearly lunchtime and there are just too many taking their state-sanctioned walks. Quote, "We can't stir a finger in this world without the risk of bringing death to somebody. So we retreat, a la Camus, avoiding also the magic tree in which neighbourhood kids leave tiny toys for each other. An economy of exchange I try with little luck to convince the girls we cannot partake in today or tomorrow. Regardless, they find a tiny Peppa Pig figurine and a small and dusty blue plastic star with a point snapped off." 11. In the cemetery at first light, first cold snap of the year. On the 4 hectares inside the sandstone walls, the long grass is dewy and waving freely in the breeze. Kangaroo grass cultivated by Gadigal and Wongal people centuries ago. Frankie and the girls, then Minky and I, follow desire lines to where they lead. The cemetery was 13 hectares in 1848, stretching out over all of what is currently Camperdown Memorial Rest Park. Before that, it was turpentine ironbark forest. Now, 18,000 bodies are buried beneath. In 1948, sandstone walls were built to contain the sprawl of the cemetery, in which a young girl, Joan Norma Ginn, had been found murdered, and in which open graves weren't being filled in for hours at a time so that paupers' bodies could be piled in. The miasma of corpses have been causing complaints, perhaps from those who believe they might catch some plague from the putrefaction. We pick purple asters from around an overgrown grave. Frankie points out bees, and the girls scream. Evie and Tilda then jump from stone to stone before scaling 2 huge mounds of wood chips. To the girls, St. Stephen's Anglican Church, Gothic Revival, is a castle where princesses live. The doors are fastened shut today, and the A4 page pinned to the hard wood is ripped in half, where everyone is welcome. All the old trees, blackwoods, English she oaks, wattles, African olives, cypress pines, Canary Island palms, Chinese elms, brush boxes and eucalypts cast so much dappled light and chirping, it feels as though we're in a movie and for a moment in stillness have slipped reality. This is where the birds have come. 12. In morning heat, much warmer today, Evie and Tilda run in circles around a raised plinth, which I sit on reading Baudelaire. quote, to go down to the cemetery where the grass was so tall and so inviting, and where such a generous sun held sway, sprawled full length on the carpet of magnificent flowers, manured by dissolution. The air was full of buzzing life, the life of the infinitely small. The girls play hide and seek in the kangaroo grass among the trees and gravestones. I can see the golden caps of their heads as they duck in the deep grass. They move in arcs, and the further away they play from me, the more it makes me nervous, even though I'm between them and the distant gates to the cemetery. A song by the National starts revolving in my head, the one in which Matthew Berenger sings of defending his family with an orange umbrella as the beat kicks in with the gravelly guitars under a core of owing voices that are probably just other versions of Sad Father Berenger. And he's repeatedly afraid of everyone. Only right now it's not raining. I've got a tote bag full of old tissues, my phone, and the cemetery is empty of other bodies. The girls find me and coax me into finding them. Maybe we should be playing Ring-a-Ring-a-Rosy from Grimm's Deutsch mythology, in which children of fortune have the power to laugh roses, as Freya wept gold. Is ashes ashes, the cremation of bodies, the burning of houses, the blackening of skin? I wonder if any of the dead buried here died of plague. I put my phone down after a quick, fruitless Google. In the shady patch, Minky, ears perked, panting, is a gargoyle. Above, an orgy of lorikeets rides in the huge swamp mahogany's white flowers. Miners swoop low beneath branches, skimming our heads and the headstones. 13. Among the gravestones, there are carved angels with trumpets heralding the day of resurrection, buds on broken stems for children, roses with buds for women who died in childbirth, ships in full sail on the tombstones of sailors who drowned in Sydney Harbour. A boy who blew himself up while celebrating Guy Fawkes Night has Catherine wheels carved on his. A soldier had a small cannon carved into his wife's tombstone. The tombstone of Thomas Downes is decorated with a hot air balloon. He was killed when a stanchion fell on him during a riot by spectators angry that the balloon had failed to take off. 14. The Morton Bay Fig Tree inside the cemetery gates appears from certain angles to be a huge petrified octopus, a Cthulhu. Facing the tree from the giant bamboo outbreak, the Morton Bay has a face. We tiptoe up its many tentacles like we're emerging from an underworld. The girls' legs tremble when they look into the dark crevices below. Running on the gravel to the right of the tall Canary Island palms, the girls crash into each other like low-flying bats, blinded by sun. Evie's hand comes out of the tangle with a bleeding hole on its palm. I gaze at the gravel like it's a Pollock painting, maybe Autumn Rhythm, but 3D, protruding as sculpture from the ground. 15. One night in 1857, after a voyage from England, the clipper ship Dunbar sank off Sydney Heads. All but one of the 122 people aboard drowned. Most passengers were Sydney residents returning home. The Dunbar's tomb in the cemetery contains the remains of 22 of those who died. Nearby is the grave of John Steen of the Royal Navy, whose body was recovered intact from the wreck. He had been cursed by Captain Thomas Watson, the harbour master of Port Jackson, for having an affair with his wife, Hannah Watson. Hannah, under the same curse, had died a few days before the shipwreck and was buried by her husband just a few metres from the plot where John's body ended up. As a ghost, Hannah has been seen drifting to the grave of her lover. 16. In candlenut trees on the way to the cemetery, the split hanging pods are like bats or broken upside-down umbrellas. Inside the cemetery walls, Frankie and I read stories on our phones about how people are dying alone, quarantined in hospitals, aged care homes, their apartments. Frankie takes a call from a lawyer about her will, while the girls, fighting after I shouted at them, stomp in opposite directions, wanting to be alone. On the woodchip path, I find a torn off magpie wing, rotting. 17. Everything is soaked, even under the thickest canopies, from bucketing rain overnight. We walk around the back of the Princess Castle, pick some baby sage and yellow cosmos, listen to today's orgy of lorikeets, this time in the other large swamp mahogany. We're walking the southern side of the cemetery today to find the alicorns because a birdie told Evie they might be found this way. We stop to listen, sit on a grave next to the spider home, a caged tomb surrounded by the dogbane and periwinkle thickly overgrowing all stones in the vicinity. Minky doesn't seem to find it a bane. Once we reach a clearing, Evie spots an alicorn flock in the sky. They eat the belly-sized candlenut leaves we offer them. When we reach the other swamp mahogany in the northwest, it's clear the lorikeets are coming and going between the two raucously. The tree's thick, chunky brown bark looks super tough, but up close is pliant, squidgy. Tilda needs to do a bush wee, which ends up going down the backs of her legs into her gumboots. On the way home, Evie finds a feather, which I decide is from a pigeon, though she says it has too much shine. In the back alleys, we meet, perched on a back gate, a black and white cat adept at keeping his distance from our loose hands. It is forbidden to spit on cats in plague time, writes Camus. 18. The colonists' gravestones have names. A single obelisk, though, commemorates the Rangers of New South Wales and the whole Aboriginal race. It names just 4 children: Tommy, William Perry, Mogo, and Mandalina. Tommy died aged 11 of bronchitis in the Sydney Infirmary, the first recorded Christian burial of an Aboriginal person. 19. In the canopy of a wide-reaching she-oak, the sun flares through a tatty black plastic bag. The oaks and Morton Bay, planted in 1848, are the oldest trees in the Marrickville district. A fallen leaf makes a crunchy blanket for the girls' unicorn toys. Grass blades as food and padding on a small square sandstone plinth. Frankie and I sit on a much larger plinth, shoulder to shoulder and doom scrolling, comparing news, including the story of a young boy who died of the virus in London. Minky rips a branch to shreds. Frankie jumps down to play chasey with the girls, running with a sense of abandon only urban wildlife could rival. She chases them to the force field, a flat grave surrounded by a knee-high cast iron fence. 20. The 4 terraces surrounded by the IGA car park and facing out toward Camperdown Memorial Rest Park and Cemetery are named Lilac, Aster, Lily, and Tulip. Inside the cemetery's walls, I reread Haunted House by Pierre Reverdy on a gravestone, underlying phrases that might speak to real estate as we now know it, haunted by exponential development, while the girls play on the 2 wood chip piles by running up and down the parabola between them like they're on a skate ramp. Quote, corroded below the waterline, clouded with heavy blotches of mold, buttresses have turned into massive blocks of ice, hedges of blood we plunge into, explosion of luxurious living, all the caprices of fortune. Behind them, wealth is being counted, land always promised and always refused. 21. Etched on the lower branches of a large hackberry tree are hundreds of initials and epithets. Quote, be gay, do crime, is painted in yellow. Beneath, Evie and Tilda leap back and forth between 2 flat gravestones, caving in toward each other. 22. Outside the walls, we lie on dewy grass, look up through branches to the sky, the commotion of birds as fluffy bunny shapes float by. Or, as cloudmonger Baudelaire described them, those moving architectural marvels that God constructs out of mist, edifices of the impalpable. We prefer bunnies today as we follow the chalked directions along the footpath. Hopscotch, run, left foot hop, right foot hop, jump, jump, jump. Now do it backwards. And then the circle of silly dance. With dozens of others in the park, Evie, Tilda and I could be doing the dance macabre above 18,000 skeletons, part of a community versus immunity Bruegel painting. I'm tempted to chalk on the concrete abracadabra, which, according to Defoe, is what Londoners wrote on pieces of paper in 1665, tied up in knots and hung around their necks to ward off whatever evil spirits brought the bubonic plague. On the walk home, a dying bee writhing on the pavement, a half moon in the late morning sky, yellow kangaroo paws, an overturned shopping trolley, graffiti of a 2-headed snake and an orange outline heart, skinks disappearing into cracks. 23. Cloudless, pink asters, early cool before forecasted heat, surely the last blurt of summer in late autumn. Evie balances her light fury, a white dragon, on the brushbox branch hanging low above the play center. The girl's new name for the gravestone they've come to build villages of flowers on in honor of alicorns again, surrounded by that knee-high cast iron fence, the force field. Only the occasional plane flies low overhead, like a bee. Quote, we tell ourselves that pestilence is a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that will pass away, but it doesn't always pass away, and from one bad dream to another, it is we who pass away. I look up from my phone and Camus, time to play. Frankie finds us mid-hide and seek in the elms near the marble cross of Eliza Emily Donathorne, the Newtown recluse who, it's said, was the inspiration for Dickens's Miss Havisham. Frankie and I linger with Donathorne's ghost. By the 1848 She-Oaks, Tilda has given up on hide and seek to collect rocks. 24. I misread what's written on the hackberry tree. Your hot air is hurting my feelings. So hot you're hurting my feelings. I lie on a gravestone in the sun, feel the warm scratch of baking sandstone. Daddy, they scream in unison. 25. Turning and now not turning, both the girls' scooters' back wheels have come off their axles. The center cannot hold. And out beyond the force field, running in widening circles around the plinth I'm on, Frankie and the girls are each now out of sight, out of earshot, as I yell into the cemetery air. The gravel driveway crunches its broken star shards beneath my feet, the same gravel that sent Evie and Tilda sprawling the other day, beneath the giant bamboo, the Morton Bay Cthulhu, and the line of Canary Island palms like massive spiky lollipops, all of them swaying, rustling, then headbanging in the wind as it picks up from somewhere deep in the ground glass sky. End.
Yeah, quite an effort. Well done. I really wanted you to read that poem because there's so much in it, and we probably don't have time to unpack very much of that. But I wanted to ask you, first of all, whether when you started writing the poem, you intended it to be the long poem that it's become, or whether it sort of was a collection of short poems that sort of merged together, or something else happened. How did it happen?
I started documenting the walks on my notes app in my phone. And, while I was chopping and changing between, letting the girls play and reading bits of news and reading bits of Camus and Boccaccio on my phone.
As you do.
Yeah, as you do. I felt like I should be doing something with the walks. They felt like something I should document for some reason. And so I just started documenting them, and they built up and built up. And so you could hear with those first few, they're testing out things, they're feeling out, specifics I had a different app on my phone, which you can take a photo of a plant and it tells you the name of it. So I learned a lot about the flowers and the trees around me as well, not just the history of the trees in the cemetery, but just everything in front of me. So there was that attention to detail that I thought would be interesting, like in a poem, and to write about it, because we were, in lockdown, we are made to look at our local surroundings in a new way, because that's all we have in those times. And so it just built from there, and I had many fragments on my phone, and then I airdropped them to my computer and started sort of shaping them.
Yeah.
And so I didn't realize it was going to be a poem, but it started to it moved that way, because most of my writing does.
Because you're a poet, right? One thing that struck me about the poem is a sense of post-apocalyptic foreboding, really. The poem is littered with references to works of literature, art, song from Baudelaire and Boccaccio, Camus, Dickens, John Forbes to Billie Eilish and Jackson Pollock, to name a few, suggestive of a rich and deeply reflective inner world. And the poem is also full of trees and birds and flowers and the ghosts of the past. But apart from you and Frankie and the girls and Minky, and some people at a distance in the park that you retreat from, it is hauntingly absent of any people. And it's really very stark. You depict an urban world of that has a huge emptiness at its center. Can you talk a bit about what is, for me, the stark juxtaposition between the inner and outer worlds in this poem?
Yeah. Yeah, there's something that I don't even reveal in the poem, and I won't say too much about it now, but because it's a little more private. But I hope it's sort of imbuing the poem, and it's you know, my own and my partner's and our kids' mortality, and you know, what the pandemic did by, you know, the fear of getting the virus and what it might do to our lungs and that kind of thing, particularly in those early months of reckoning with the plague and realizing what it's doing to the world, and what it could end up doing to you. And, you know, that those ground glass images are deliberate, and, you know, there's a fear I'm trying to write about. There's a kind of, you know, and personal circumstances which aren't in the poem, like personal family circumstances, which I aren't really alluding to, but I feel are there under the poem as well. And you know, so I guess I'm trying to I was trying to work through lots of ways of alluding to that sort of inner anxious fear about it as well. I mean, the starkness of the outside world was just a real thing. Like, there were just, on most days, no one around, because everyone's isolating. And even, I mean, there's a day or two there that I do depict where the weather's really nice and a lot of people are out doing their walks because we're in the middle of the daytime. And so those were kind of contrasting walks to some of the other walks, which were earlier in the day. And often even when it was busy in the park around the cemetery, when we went into the cemetery, there was still fewer and fewer people. So there was always this sense of, well, there was that sense of oasis, but also just like, we were seeking out a more pleasurable isolation too. We were trying to find more comforting isolation in what was pretty stark, I guess.
Yeah. And the children's play is a really sort of important sort of part of this poem, isn't it? That there's a kind of hopefulness there that some things go on unchanged.
Yeah, absolutely. And also a concern, you know, like a natural parental kind of like worry and concern about how all these circumstances will affect them and their futures. So I hope that sort of is coming through as well.
Yeah, I got the sense of it that there's so much movement in the poem, through the wind, through the children's play, through flocks of birds in the sky or amongst the trees, and the language you use: walking, circling, running, crashing, chasing, swooping, skimming, waving, jumping, scaling, leaping. And the sense that I had of that was that, plague or not, apocalypse or not, ultimately life will not be denied.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I think that's what I was meaning to say by, you know, seeking out, you know, we were seeking out where we could have life, where we could find fun and love and enjoyment, and because that's so important. And you know, it's actually a difficult thing to write in poems as well, that sort of, those sort of more positive outlooks and feelings. And so it was I felt like it was an experiment in that as well. I don't mean to sound scientific, but I wanted to write and depict those happier moments as well, to contrast a lot of the other bleakness. And you know, also, you know, there's a lot of humor preceding this in the book as well, but there's also a lot of bleakness too. So I feel like it brings another element to the book at the end as well.
There's a lot of balancing of all those different things, which is what we do in life as well, isn't it? Daily.
Yeah, and there's a range of themes and images that happen in poems earlier in the book that recur in this longer poem too, from the bats to the bees and the planes and trains and lots of those things. I like to think that they start to take on multiple meanings as well when you're able, when I'm able to sort of have them referring back to each other across poems too.
Yeah, the poems talk to one another. And also, in the sense I had, the historical overview in this poem. It keeps returning to history, to the long view, as you call it, the big picture, to Gadigal and Wongal land, to the multiple histories contained in the cemetery, which you explore at some depth and which is fascinating, of murders and paupers and shipwrecked sailors and curses and ghosts and death by various forms of misadventure. Is that in one way saying that this too shall pass?
Perhaps. I mean, this is a moment in history that will be very historicized. I was also just like, I just realized that I hadn't learned much about the local history, and it's my favorite, one of my favorite places in the world, that cemetery, and I've gone to it for many years, and I just had to read about it and start to think about it. And I mean, obviously, there's just death abounds in its history, of course, because it's a cemetery. But like, I mean, it's a poet's cliche, really, to write about cemeteries and to sit in them and all that kind of thing. But I had to do it. I just like that was what was available to me as well in lockdown, and I'm really thankful in some ways that I read more about it and learnt more about it. You know, it gives me a different perspective of just my local suburb, and where I'll be returning to live there next year. But yeah.
I mean, it's easy for us to walk the earth full of our own unknowing in a way. And it actually does take real attention to pick away at that unknowing and learn about what is all around us. And it's easy not to do. Life gets in the way in a way sometimes.
Well, absolutely it does. But I also think that's one of the roles of a poet, and good poets always do that. They're always, like you said before about seeing, they're always sort of trying to see those things anew, trying to see those things, you know, whether they're historical or in the moment. And, you know, part of the power of poetry is being able to transmit that to the reader to see anew as well. So, you know, that's always a central sort of aim, I guess, when I'm writing too. Even if what I'm writing might seem a little bit wildly linguistically nonsensical, those things are also paying attention and looking at language and how we use language in the world, how, you know, how social discourse and political discourse uses language to manipulate, and you know, so, you know, to be able to critique those things is really important, and to be able to document those things and give a fresh perspective is really important as a poet.
Well, thanks so much, Toby, for sharing poems on and insights, many insights on the theme of duration. On that theme, Toby, I've been in Sydney for 5.5 years, and I've been to the Sappho poetry readings on many occasions, and this is the first time I've heard you read. So It's a great pleasure. I don't know how that happened, but it's a great pleasure finally to hear you read. When this video is posted, it will include a link to your website, Toby, where you can find information on all of Toby's books. So look out for that. And please check in again at the end of November, when Poets Corner will feature Jill Jones on the theme Digressions, Ambling and Detritus, Poetry as Fieldwork. See you then.
Thanks very much for having me, David, and thanks to WestWords.